Welcome to The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill. The Burning Question, where we ask the questions no one wants to answer.
Welcome to The Burning Question. I'm Pamela Segneri.
And I'm Paul Tothill.
And this is the show where we ask the questions that no one wants to answer. We've brought together a panel of experts to help answer these questions, and we invite you to become part of the discussion on our Facebook page.
Our guest panellists today are Matthew Tothill, an independent primary school teacher, and Dr. Jillian from Principals Australia Institute.
And the burning question today is the current education model addressing the needs of the new millennium.
Matthew and Jill, to answer the burning question, perhaps I can propose another question and we can work through that, because there'd be lots of people at home that might not have any idea about what education is. So when we talk about education, what is the purpose of education? Jill, perhaps you first.
Happy to speak to that. I think that the African proverb, it takes a village to educate a child, is pretty apposite in this context. Education can be seen as a great cost to governments, but I think it's better looked at as a great investment, and its purpose is in the first instance about individual children learning to do and know and be and live together. It has an instrumental value, and governments are interested in this, obviously, the relationship between education and employment and the economy. And I think really importantly, it has a great social value. So young people learning about the values of living in a civil society, becoming an active and engaged citizen. And I think the goals of education for Australian young people are summed up very succinctly and usefully in the Melbourne Declaration by the Ministerial Council on Education, Training and Youth Affairs from 2008. And that refers to the goals for Australian education being around all young people in Australia being successful learners, yep, being creative and innovative individuals, and being actively engaged citizens. So that's quite a good blueprint, I think.
Excellent. And Matt, how would you describe? Would you agree with what Jill's saying?
Oh yeah, what Jill said. No. No. From a teaching perspective, I believe that I'm trying to develop, and I know that teachers throughout Australia are trying to develop compassionate lifelong learners, and I think that's a simple way of summing it up. But if we can endeavour to do that, then we're on the right track.
So often we see education the responsibility of schools or principals or governments, but what you both seem to be proposing is that education is really far broader than that, and it's far deeper than that, and it's more expansive than that.
Yes, well, it goes beyond probably a more typical understanding of education, and yes, education is about the whole student as opposed to something that's compartmentalised into subjects.
So, Jill, it's not just about numeracy and literacy.
Certainly not. Obviously those things are important, but young people developing in a holistic kind of way is really important. Their social and emotional well-being, critical things, and that underpins their academic achievement. But I'd agree with Matt. I think that I talked about learning to live together. That speaks to cultural understanding, active engagement as a contributing adult. It's a whole person thing, and it requires a partnership between home and school, carers and teachers, principals as leaders in the community as well as in the school. So it's a massive endeavour.
It seems quite large. I just wonder then, do we value education in that way as a community? I mean, do you feel that there's that level of understanding, or do you think there's a bit of tension in the community between what I've said before as parents saying, well, I send my children to school, maybe that's your job. How do you create the tearing down of those walls if they exist?
That's a really good question, and schools now have a responsibility, I think, to educate the parents as well as educate the children. So as we're evolving as a school, and as we're evolving with the children in the current climate, we have a responsibility to evolve with the students, but then also educate the parents on what that looks like. So, I mean, that's from my perspective. I believe, that perhaps answers your question.
Yeah, so education in the new millennium, and I guess that's what a lot of people have very little understanding. This is a new frontier. We've not been here before. And so sometimes, I guess, looking from the outside in, one could mistakenly think, well, has this really changed from when I went to school? But it has if you get engaged in it. But I think, as we've both said, parents and the community need to be engaged in the educational process, because it's a life thing. It is much bigger.
I think there have been changes. When you commented that has anything changed, I think that there's a really sharp and clear focus on the importance of evidence to inform decision making, and I think that digital resources have proved to be a really powerful tool for teachers and school leaders and principals to collect data, analyse data, to form evidence about, what was the impact of what we've just done, and how will that inform what we do next. I think there's a very clear focus on that, and I think that's a significant development for the good.
Yeah, I guess people think these things because they're not engaged in the process, and it's really easy to do what Paul said earlier, say, well, we pay for you to teach our kids, so you get on with it and I'll pick them up at 4 o'clock. But that's not good enough anymore. We as parents need to step up and be engaged in the process, and in fact, I guess the whole community needs to be.
Well, the research shows, doesn't it, that where there's participation from parents and the wider society in education, you achieve better outcomes. Would that be right?
Yes, I think if we look at the professional standard for Australian school principals, an important area of that relates to engaging with the community, and that recognises that very fact, that education takes place not in a vacuum but within a community.
We'll come back in a minute and we'll pick that thought up again.
Okay.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Liemex timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Liemex. Liemex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
So Jill, just going back to that thought, let's just cover off on that and then we can move on.
Yes, the thought related to the importance of engaging with the community, and I think that really recognises the reality that young people and children come from a family, from a community, and it's a collaborative project, education, and that it involves home, it involves teachers, it involves school leaders, and it involves the young person. They have an important role to play too, because learning's hard, it's hard work, and the learning comes from the struggle. And our public discourse needs to reflect that more than it perhaps has been in the past.
Yeah, exactly.
And Matt, so would you say then, off the back of what Jill's saying, is that really we can't divorce education out of the family, out of society, and you're a life learner, if you will?
Well, from my observations is that learning, you don't switch your brain off. So learning is happening all the time, and the best way to, obviously the teachers are trained in facilitating that and guiding that, but obviously that happens when in the conversations at home, it happens at the dinner table, it happens on the computer, it happens everywhere. So I think there's a responsibility, it's the responsibility of everyone to help direct the young people of the future. So
How important then is it for the teacher and the parent to invest in a relationship that has learning at its centre for the child or the children of the family. I mean, obviously that relationship has to be developed if it's new or if it's progressive.
Yes.
How would you go about that, and is it valuable?
Well, the way you go about something like that is you have to develop common goals, and you have to communicate with each other effectively, and you also have to have similar values, I think, and I think that's really important, because obviously if you're going in if you want your child to go in a certain direction, that obviously if you're the teacher and the parent and the grandparent are all on the same page, it's just more efficient. So it's definitely that's not always going to happen, but I think at the end of the day it's definitely a step forward, and at the end of the day it puts the child at the centre or the core of everyone, and I think that's really important.
Yeah.
So, Jill, you deal primarily with principals and the leadership model within schools. I mean, it sounds a little bit more complex now that we've had a bit of a discussion than what most of the community might believe, that there's actually quite a bit involved in being an educator and certainly being a principal and leading a school. What are the sort of problems or complexities that principals, for example, might have to engage in?
Well, that's only an hour show.
Yes, and that's a huge question. I think Principals Australia Institute has been working with school principals and leaders for a long time, and is a leading provider of professional learning, and surveys principals regularly. So from that surveying work, we know that the things that are really challenging school principals right now are matters to do with managing student wellbeing, keeping up to date with pedagogy, adapting to changing regulatory frameworks, to name three. But there are also matters to do with human resource management, budget management. So these days, school principals, as well as being educational leaders, really need a broad raft of business-related skills, and for which perhaps the past practice hasn't necessarily prepared them for particularly thoroughly. So that's a real challenge, I think, for principals to balance all of that administrative work with the demands of being an educational leader. And it's a source of pressure and source of stress.
And of course there is an emphasis, isn't there, of principals and local school communities to start developing themselves in their context more and more, isn't there? Yes,
I think that's a dangerous road to go as well. I think that from my experience working as an educator and with educators by and large are really generous people. They're collegial, collaborative kind of people, and they're keen to share best practice so that best practice can become common practice. So competition for students, for instance, sits a little bit at odds with that.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily in the young person's best interest. But all of that said, I think there's an overarching collegiality between educators that prevails.
That's very good.
I was just going to say, you mentioned the word pedagogy.
I'm glad you're going to ask a question about that.
This is an educator's term, and most people say what? So just share with us. I mean, Matthew, you obviously know what it is, and I do because I did the research. But if you could just kind of unpack it for us, is it an art or a science?
Well, I guess if you think about arts as having a technical base, and to underpin an innovation that has to be first imagined, and then it has to be conceptualised, and then it has to be realised. Pedagogy, in that sense, is an art.
Yeah.
If you think of a science as being the structured pursuit of an answer to a question, and that question has to be imagined, and then it needs to be conceptualised and realised, then pedagogy's got scientific elements as well. So is it an art, is it a science? It's a bit of both, really.
Yeah. But so for everyone who thought, I wonder what that means. Is this something else they're trying to snow us with? No, this is a real term. And
it is a real term.
It's really important that that we understand as parents that, you know, teachers, principals do so much more. And this is what you've been saying already, you know, that you really study your craft.
Yes, I mean, pedagogy is about the pursuit of learning and how does learning happen best, and what evidence have we got about our impact. Did this intervention work effectively or not? If not, did any of it work? So that it's an iterative process.
Yeah.
You know, it's really important that a young person makes a year's worth of progress in a calendar year of input.
Yeah.
And without constantly evaluating evidence of impact, then that doesn't happen.
Yeah. So education
necessarily
is a set and forget.
No, it's not.
So Matt, you're on the ground the day to day with young boys at an interesting age, and just taking that on board. I mean, the art, the fluidity, the flexibility. I mean, how do you go about it? Is it going to differ? I mean, if the curriculum is set, for example, there's an accepted curriculum, how you administer that curriculum, is that going to change? How does that work?
Well, yeah, the curriculum is set. The curriculum does change, but you know, not as sporadically as say a child, but the curriculum does. So what we're looking at doing is implementing something that is fixed we're looking at implementing something that is fixed to a dynamic group of students. So absolutely, there's elements of creativity and change there, and adaptability, and you know, we have to be open-minded continually as teachers to try and make it work, to engage them in that process. Now, we also have to, the key thing here is understanding and knowing each student, because every student isn't going to receive that information the same. So how do we manipulate that to best suit our student base? You know, really good teachers do that effectively, and you know, in sometimes get more than a year's progress out of their students, which is...
Okay, we're going to come back to that in just a minute, Matt.
Sure.
It's obviously a big question, so we'll come back shortly.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Liemex timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Liemex. Liemex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your host Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Jillian, you made a really good point that we measure what we value. And, you know, so let's kind of pick that up where Matthew was and you were, and I'll leave it up to you.
We were talking about academic attainment and the importance of a young person making a year's progress in a calendar year of input. And we were agreeing, I think, about the importance of young people's social and emotional well-being. And I think I was suggesting that if it's important, there are ways of measuring that, or the effectiveness of programs. So I'm thinking about Kids Matters Primary and Mind Matters, which are both social or mental health and wellbeing frameworks that PAI, or Principals Australia Institute, rolls out in schools around the nation. And those frameworks include provision for, in fact require, evaluation of impact, and that can be done using the instruments that you might use in qualitative research, so survey type responses, for instance. And Matt, I think we were agreeing that some aspects of what we're talking about here in terms of personal development don't really become evident until the young person is 30, 40, 50 years of age. So that's quite hard to
call them back and
test them. But by the same token, I think if we say that social and emotional well-being are important, then we do need to be able to evaluate whether what we're doing to address that kind of development is having a positive impact or not.
It'll definitely, it's a really good insight, and I think that it's just creating balance, I think, in the way that we look at the development of a child, so that we can look at, for example, their progress academically, but we can also look at their social and emotional progress as well, so that the student is developing as a lifelong learner, as the whole learner, as opposed to, say, just someone who's a vessel for academia, or someone, for example, who's just a good guy. It's a matter of making sure that we do that. I think the tools are perhaps here already for the quantitative measurements in terms of your skills, but the tools are still being developed, or we're catching up in terms of the neuroscience and the social emotional development.
Yes, yeah.
So it's definitely, in terms of looking at children for the future, it is going to change. I think that dynamic will change again, and I think that, like I said, there'll be a more balanced approach going forward, and that'll probably look a little bit different to the way that I went to school. You guys might have gone to school as well.
So the model that, for example, when I was at school, would look, I suspect, very different than the young children that are going to school these days. And it would seem to me then that there is a certain amount of research that's developing, and education is evolving. We're becoming a little bit more sophisticated, perhaps, with our understanding and looking not just at the technical outcomes, but also the wider outcomes for a child.
Yes, I'd agree with that, and I think there's a much clearer understanding that a key part of the point of assessment, it's not about measuring an aspect of the young person per se. It's actually about measuring the impact that the teacher's intervention has had. So, and I think that's quite a different mindset to be bringing.
So not just an outcome.
So it's about using assessment in a formative way, whether it's a mental health program or a maths program, to know, is it working? Or could I have just done nothing, and the child or the young person might be doing exactly the same thing, and if that's the case, then why have I bothered?
Does this go back, do you think, to Matt's earlier point about the creativity in the learning model? Because we have different kinds of learners, don't we? Children are unique. And I think you said earlier in the program that the history that they come into school with, the history and the culture that surrounds them outside of school, it all shapes the ability to learn, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that's in the first 7 years of life, and perhaps even longer, a young person spends more time with carers than they do at school.
Yes.
So that the broader context from which the young person is coming has a profound impact. So that's really important to recognise, I think.
Yeah.
And we were expecting so much from teachers, principals, in so many ways, apart from teaching maths, science, and English. And I'm not talking about foreign languages. We're expecting teachers to have the skills to come in and talk about drugs and to talk about youth suicide and bullying's always a big one, but so these are the things that you're talking, the mental health issues that you actually can quantifiably address. You can see where you're making.
You can. Yes,
difference.
I think Kids Matter Primary and Mind Matters, to name two specific examples with which I'm familiar or a little familiar. Yes, they're structured frameworks that. I mean, a school A might implement the framework quite differently from school B, and that's absolutely fine because context is such a big factor. But that having been said, with any program, it's really important that the teachers who are implementing the program are getting some feedback about what's working. And if this is not working, then you need to either fine-tune it, not you. The practitioner needs to fine-tune it or stop doing it. And there's lots of research around about the impact that different strategies have. And the two most important factors are the positive relationship that a young person has with their teacher that underpins all their other achievement, and the other critical thing is, in terms of making a difference for young people, teachers in a school having a collective sense of efficacy, that is, believing as a team of teachers that they can make a difference and that all young people can learn.
Yes.
That has a profound effect on whether young people do learn or not.
Yeah.
Then the role of a teacher in their creativity and their teaching paradigm to a class is actually quite more complicated than perhaps most of the public might realise.
Quite possibly.
Quite possibly. Well, it seems today from our discussion that it is complex, and we're in a transitionary society where some of these issues that might not have had the same value are certainly becoming even more valuable, and perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit later on.
Yeah. So let's go to a break right now, and we'll come back and we'll carry on from it. I'm sure this is only a 1 hour show.
Massive
But we'll be
subject.
back soon.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Liemex timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Liemex. Liemex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your host Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Paul, you were just on a roll there. Let's continue on.
Well, the train of thought was we're starting to see, hopefully, that things are a little bit more complex than what we first thought, and we all need to be participants in society with education, so lifelong learning, but also the variety and the skill set that's needed in a teacher to not only articulate, connect, create a language, but also journey a child through the education process. So Matt, at the ground floor level, if you will, to outwork this.
I'm always at the ground floor.
You've got to start somewhere. The ground floor you build everything from.
That's okay.
Can't have a roof
The
without a
door.
basement. So in the practicality, the outworking of this, I mean, what are some of the tensions that you go through as a teacher day to day to bring this kind of creativity, diversity and understanding to your students?
Yeah, day to day, you're constantly reflecting, and you're constantly adapting, you're constantly adjusting to your environment, and to allow to work out how best this is going to work. Another really important thing is to, like I said, to listen to the child so that you can understand what's going on. I think that if you just go in with an agenda, okay, this is what I'm going to do today, and it doesn't work out, sometimes you can feel frustrated or upset that it didn't work out the way you wanted, but what you then do is that changes your approach. And if that changes your approach, then all of a sudden all other things start happening. Yeah, it's really important that when you go in each day, on the day to day, and have a plan, but also be receptive to what if that changes, and how can I change the scenario to get the best outcome out of today? Because that's the goal at the end of the day, is to get the best outcome for what you're trying to achieve.
So you're not just a teacher, you're also a leader, something like a life coach. You're trying to draw the best out of each child as you develop learning behaviours and outcomes.
Yeah, you also, that's right, and so you are guiding and coaching and teaching all in one, as well as educating the students. You're also learning yourself, and I think yeah, it's really important for us to acknowledge that as a teacher, that hang on a sec, we're not always right either. So that sometimes there are students that know more than you in a certain domain. So for example, as a student that knows lots about Pokemon. Now I might not have any idea what Pokemon is, and for me to even,
Nor might I.
So you might have a panel here, and then you'll have a couple more students if you want to talk about Pokemon. But to acknowledge each other respectfully in your own domain, and that way you can have those conversations and learn from them also. So
Well, that certainly wasn't my experience from school. There was no interaction that way. It was one-way traffic.
it is one-way traffic, and you do have those days. But at the end of the day, you try your best to understand the student, so then you can relate to the student, which means that you're more effective in your practice, which means that the message gets across clearer. And if you look at, say, something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the students then feel comfortable with you, they're more receptive to what you say, and as they say, respect is earned, it's not demanded of. And I think that if you can get to that position, I said that you'll be far more effective as a practitioner. So yeah, I don't know if that helps you out at all, but yeah.
So Jillian, Jill, you were saying about the relationship, you're talking about the trust. What I heard from you was about the role of trust with a teacher and a student in a classroom.
And I think, picking up what Matt was saying, yes, a young person who knows that their teacher respects them as a human being and listens to them and is interested in them, and the teacher, in listening to what the young person is saying, is in part evaluating evidence of their impact, so that the teacher's figuring out, that didn't go so well, I'll have to try to explain that a different way.
Yep.
So children and young people, they pick up on that. So they know this teacher really cares about me, this teacher really is interested in how I'm going. So that's a great motivator.
Yeah. Is there a drawback to that? I mean, we live, I think you were saying, Pam, of this whole idea that we live in such an electronic age, and kids are off on their Xboxes and all those sorts of things. Not anymore? It's beyond that?
Yeah, iPads.
Oh, okay, all right. So iPads can be... I'm just watching my nephews and my nieces say. So iPad, it can be a great learning tool, but also it can be a great disinhibiting tool as far as learning, but can polarise us, can't it, relationally? And how do you overcome that?
It disconnects us relationally oftentimes. So whilst it's useful in the context that you were addressing before, in terms of gathering data and just disseminating what we've learnt in certain things, if we're just on here and we're on Facebook mindlessly, you know, like, hey, go and talk to your friends. I am talking to my friends, in Kazakhstan, or, and it's about relationship, and that's why what you guys are talking about is so important. We're human beings.
I was going to say, if you're on Facebook now and you're commenting, just make it
a good comment.
Yes, I think, as with most things, it's about balance, isn't it?
Yes.
I'm thinking in terms of relationships, language programs benefit enormously from technology. That it might be beyond the means of a school, a family, for a young person to go overseas for a year's immersion in that particular language. But by partnering using electronic means, then lots can be achieved in language classrooms, for instance. So it's horses for courses. And teachers, as professionals, as professional educators, as leaders of learning, and school leaders and principals, are responsible for making professional judgments about what's the most appropriate tool.
It is really interesting, because I'm not a prophet, but technology I don't think is going away, and so it's really important that we embrace it. But then we have to consider, instead of taking it away and saying, look, you're not achieving what we want you to achieve, so we're going to take it away. We have to teach the students on how to use it. The difficulty with technology is it's really distracting. As with previously, you used to go get a book. You didn't have Nerf guns popping up left, right and centre, or you didn't have whatever your previous searches have been popping up while you're doing it, or someone emailing you, or Facebook messages popping up. So the skill going forward is going to be not only teaching them how to use it, but also how to focus. And that's probably the new challenge for schools, and it's also keeping up with the students, I think, with technology. So, for example, a lot of students would probably be more technologically advanced than their teachers. So therefore that they're going to have to not only embrace that, but try and keep ahead of the game, so that they can embrace that.
So we're going to come back. This is This is running away with us. It's so interesting. But I hope you're getting as much out of it as what we are. And we'll be back after this break.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Liemex timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Liemex. Liemex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
So let's just pick that up, what we were talking about with, you know, is digital good? Is like you said, it's not going away. So I think it's kind of almost snuck up on everyone at an alarming rate, and now we have to kind of think, okay, so how do we deal with it? But as parents, you know, we can deal with it on one level, but that's usually, you know, take it away. But as teachers, you know, you see it from a different point of view and you see the value in it. But to get the children to understand there is value in that, but there's also value in picking up a book and just really absorbing, getting involved in a great story without, as you said, all the pop-ups. You know?
Sure, and I think that there's every reason to have faith in the professional judgment of teachers and school leaders about making those kinds of calls. That yes, it's reading novels has its place still, and being able to assess information gleaned from the internet, that has its place also. In some ways, the power of the computer that children have and young people have in their hands, just in their phone, it really elevates the level of thinking that's required. That straight old, you don't know what the capital of this remote country is, well, you just look it up. It's not the information that matters, it's the knowledge that you create out of that information. So that's where the focus has shifted.
So knowledge is one thing, and obviously you are educating children, young adults to become valuable members of the community, to add to the community, to develop their skill set within a community. I mean, obviously then we're not saying, are we, the thought might be, well, everything's electronic, what about their ability to relate? I mean, I know, speaking to some employers, they perceive a difficulty of very intellectual people having a difficulty, or they're great on the electronic device, but when it comes to a one-on-one conversation or working in a team or having resilience, well, that might be another kettle of fish. I mean, what you're saying today is, well, it's not either or.
No.
It's an and conversation. So how do you go about particular developing resilience or those sort of skills within the classroom?
Well, it's interesting you say that, and as you know, content is far more accessible than it ever has been before, and so teaching content when it is so accessible, you have to now look at how do we approach that content. And how, so for example, we will look at something like your research skills. So for example, how do I've got content here, is it valuable, is it not? How can I then organise that information? How do I interpret that information, and how do I connect that information? So then, I mean, initially you have to formulate the question. So, I mean, that's all part of your research skills. But on top of that, you've also got your communication skills. Which you've got your thinking skills, you've got self-management skills, you've got your social skills. So those 5 domains are all interrelated, and we call them, you know, we're from an IB school, so we call these transdisciplinary skills, because all those skills are beneficial to you in maths, English, science. Whatever you do, you're going to need those 5 skill sets. So it's really important that they are explicitly taught and exposed in a schooling system, so that like you said, you might have all this knowledge and content, but if you can't communicate it, so there needs to be a balance of skills to not only find the information, but then communicate the information and then socialise that information, etc. And same with the self-management skills. If you can't sit still, for example, that's going to impact how you communicate or how you're received.
Of course.
So those. Those domains are important. It's not something that we traditionally consider a skill, perhaps, but that's the way that we want to approach our learning, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. So the idea of developing the whole person, is that more the approach than just, as I said at the beginning of the program, numeracy and literacy? The old idea, actually, we're slowly dissolving the walls and seeing it's a far bigger picture.
Yes, I think that the whole person, that notion of I mentioned the Melbourne Declaration a while ago, and I think that captures it in many ways. But learning how to learn and becoming creative and innovative individuals, and becoming active and contributing members of society. So that's a holistic view of the growth and development of a young person. So it's not just about the academic; it's about how that individual can synthesise and also how they can interact with other people.
So and it makes everyone feel valued.
Absolutely.
Regardless of what their IQ may be.
Or for example, if your thinking skills are very good. You're a really good analytical thinker, but you are finding it difficult to socialise, then you might, for example, be able to self-assess, and self-assessment is really important. That's where your strength is, and that's where your deficiency perhaps is. So therefore you might be able to acknowledge someone else in the classroom who's good in that domain, and you might be able to then acknowledge them, like I said before, with your old schooling system, as just acknowledging someone for their thinking skills or analytical thinking skills, that then you can see value and purpose to everybody. So that's creates a more balanced and society, classroom environment as well. So
makes your job easier.
In what role, as educators, do you see the role of teaching young people responsibility?
A responsibility for their learning?
Yeah, for their own learning.
Oh, I think that's really important. For example, that's a really big question.
It is a really big question. It's a really good time. I think we take a break. So you think about your answer, and you just.
Over to Jill.
And we'll be back right after this break.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Liemex timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Liemex. Liemex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your host Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Let's just continue on with that discussion about, the value, people seeing value and the responsibility of the student.
I think that responsibility for one's own learning is learned over time, obviously, and parents and carers have got a really important role to play by where they place value, and I think it's if their feedback is about the process that their young person is going through, and if they're asking questions like what questions did you ask at school today, and what did you find out about yourself, what process did you use to do X, Y, Z, rather than having their focus on the outcome, that's more likely to breed the persistence and the toughness and the grit that a responsible lifelong learner is going to need. It's about the process.
No, I agree completely. It is about the process and valuing that process, which is really important. And it is difficult.
Excuse me.
To not only value the process, but also value, like I said, the broad range of skill sets we were talking about before, and rewarding those that broad range also. So, for example, let's say, for example, we've got, the concern is some of the habits perhaps we're creating in an older school system might be that you do something well, you get rewarded for it. Now, so for some students, they might find, especially say some high functioning students, they might be able to already do something really well. Yeah. So therefore, they might find that easy. Are they developing and growing by doing that? Not necessarily. Mm. So, and definitely they would be in some part. But at the end of the day, for example, you might set them a goal okay, can you reflect on your thinking? Can you then self-assess? Can you then work out? Can we then work with the teacher to work out what's your next step? Mm. It's a more challenging idea. Sure. Mm. So therefore, the idea is that we can develop a greater growth for all the students, as opposed to a more homogenous model. And not to say that the current model is far more open and conceptual, which is great, but say, for example, that's what it's evolved to help create the opportunities that there are today.
So rather than a student just simply receiving, which has been very much the traditional model, and outcome orientated, and that's really been the dominant measurement, what we're hearing today is there is a lot more investment into the whole person, but also getting a child to start thinking, independent thinking, and creating learning and valuing that process. Would that be right?
Yes, and I think for the members of the community to grasp that learning's hard, and that the value needs to be put on the process, and that the teachers and school leaders have expertise, and they're to be trusted and to be worked with. And rather than criticised and derided. Yes. So.
Do we need to reconsider then in the community the value we place on teachers and teaching? I know what the answer's going to be, but just as a way of discussion, I mean...
No, that's unfair. You can't ask them. They're in the job. Ask me. Right. I believe yes, we should, because if our children and our grandchildren are valuable, then should we not have the very, very best people teaching them?
Well, I think you sang the song earlier, Pam, children are our future.
But I won't sing it again.
No, sing it again. And so if children are our future, obviously we've got this unusual situation where things are transitioning in Australia and globally. Yeah. Jobs that once existed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, in the 80s, that kind of emphasis, they're no longer around. We've got a different range of potential jobs that are emerging, and some jobs don't even yet exist for which we're educating our children. I mean, that must be a challenge in of itself.
Yes, I mean, it's pretty hard to educate someone for something that doesn't exist. What you can do is cultivate a state of mind, a disposition around being open-minded and adaptable, flexible, a risk taker, and that tone is set by the principal. By the school leaders, that's picked up by the teachers. So we come back time and time again that you don't have a great school without a great principal.
And great teachers and work with a great principal.
That's right.
And a good community as well, that's supportive of that. Because I'm not sure, Jillian, and I'm asking you as someone who represents lots of principals, for example, if there is a community that's perhaps, because something might look different to the way they went to school, that there would be perhaps an uncertainty within them and within the community that can then cause, does it cause inefficiencies in the school environment or school culture, because they're constantly defending rather than developing?
Yeah. I think that's a good point, and I think that one of the important aspects of the principal's role is to be a leader of change and a champion of change, to understand implementing change and the critical importance of bringing the school family or the school community along. You talked before about educating parents, so explaining, well, here's the situation, here's the strategy, here's the big picture, this is what we're doing, and engaging the community. And again, that's part of the principal standard.
Then as the community, do we need to probably change our discussion and change our value system, perhaps?
Probably, yes. I think we've talked several times about valuing teachers, valuing expertise, valuing the process of learning. I think valuing school leaders and school principals, and the best, to value expertise, you have to be able to identify it, and to identify it, you need some kind of measurement process. For teachers, there's a certification process to identify highly accomplished and lead teachers. Principals Australia Institute has been working with principals around the country to develop a certification program for school principals, and that's exactly what it's about, identifying exemplary practice with a view to celebrating it in the first instance, so peer recognition, public recognition, but really importantly also to provide exemplars for aspiring principals to aspire to. Because a reality facing Australian education that we haven't talked about, you talked about transitioning a few moments ago, is the fact that 80% of the country's principals are aged 50 years or more.
Wow.
So what that means is, across the next 10 to 15 years, we're looking at a really massive changeover and a whole lot of expertise walking out the door. So the critical importance of Australian principal certification is to capture some of that expertise. So yes, elevating the status of the principal profession, and yes, providing public recognition for those principals, but as important is the role that certification of principals will have in providing a raft of exemplars for future school leaders. This is what it looks like to be a school principal.
Wow. I mean, there's so much we could talk about.
Absolutely.
But I want to thank you so much for coming on today, Jill.
Pleasure.
And Matthew. Been outstanding, and I hope you've enjoyed some insight to a very big problem, and you've satisfied that burning question.
Yeah, so the burning question was, is the current education model meeting the needs of the new millennium? Well, I think if you've heard anything, we're certainly working towards it.
Absolutely.
And so I just encourage you to go to our Facebook page, make a comment, because we'd love to hear from you. And I hope you've enjoyed the show. We'll see you next time.
The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.